Hello, yes, hi, sorry, I was not sure. Okay, hi everyone. This is our panel on climate change, food security, and conflict. And we have a great bunch of panelists here. I am in front of this painting of one of the oldest cedars in Lebanon that my brother made in 2018 when he visited me in Beirut. And I think it's a good image to start with because I did a story that year about cedars and how they were threatened by climate change for various reasons. And not only as an important cultural symbol, but as a key part of the ecosystem. And this is really a bridge between the work I did in the Middle East with so many problems as we've been discussing. None of these problems exist in a vacuum. All the social and political, economic problems affect the climate and vice versa. And when I came back to New York, I started considering climate change as it affects New York City. Like many of the great port cities around the world, including Beirut, it has a whole other issue related to sea level rise and increasing heat. So I would like we're gonna have a format where we talk, we ask some questions to the different panelists, and we'll have a discussion with among ourselves, and hopefully have a little time for the audience. Our first, what order I will introduce you in 1 second. Sorry, I have too many things open here. Okay. Oops. Sorry about this. I have a technical difficulty. Okay. So we have Marwa Daoudy, who's a non-resident scholar at the Malcolm Carnegie Middle East Center, and she is we have Olivia Lazard, who is at Carnegie Europe, Justin Dargin, a non-resident scholar in the Middle East program, and did I get everyone? Yes. Sorry, I'm missing the paper that has everyone's resume. So maybe each of you, when you answer the first question, I don't want to get anything wrong. So just give us a line or two about the thing you're studying most recently. We'd like to talk about first, just looking at the way the climate is changing, becoming more variable, and we have a problem of global food supplies affected by the Ukraine war and many factors, access to food, and millions of people are at risk of being driven into starvation. We would like to talk about security and climate and how it might affect increasing waves of climate migration. Let's start with as heat waves and drought are becoming the new norm, grain production and agriculture is disrupted across the region, in the European Union, but also in Tunisia, Iran, Egypt, Iraq. Of course, we've seen in the past in Syria. So we have political unrest that not only with Russia, Ukraine, but internal unrest in different countries have affected food security as people's earning power drastically around the region. Let's start with Olivia. What do you see as the expected impact of climate change in the coming years, particularly related to food security and agriculture?
Thank you, Anne. When we talk about climate and its impacts, we usually have to talk in terms of systems and direct disruptions. So let's start with the systems in terms of what's going on with regards to the climate regime. 2 days ago, I checked the last temperature anomalies in the Arctic, and the Arctic is now experiencing a 6.4 degrees Celsius anomaly. That means that snow is not advancing, and there is on average more rain for the very first time in history than snow. This is both a result of what is unfolding in terms of the climate crisis, but it's also an indicator of what's to come in the next year and the next years. The second thing to understand about what's coming our way in 2023, 2024 is that it's very likely that we'll be shifting from a La Nina cycle to an El Nino cycle. El Nino is usually associated to higher global temperatures and more erratic types of hydrological events, including floods and different types of storms. So what we've been calling higher than temperature averages in the Middle East and Europe, which we've been observing over the last 2 summers particularly, well, that's likely to bump up in 2023 and 2024. And it's quite likely that it will be accompanied by more drought as a result, but also more flooding events. The other thing which is important to keep in mind, especially as we see temperatures rising up, is that it's going to have a knock-on effects on longer-term trajectories, specifically regarding tipping points. And the tipping point theory is important because about, I think, 3 months ago, Tim Lenton, Johan Roykström, and other authors issued a paper hammering in the fact that we really shouldn't go over the 1.5 target unless we start triggering the tipping point theory, whereby we have a slowdown of the AMOC, the savanization of the Amazon, some issues or cascading impacts on El Nino, and a number of different events, including in the poles and the Barents Sea, et cetera, et cetera. The part that is particularly important is the fact that if we have higher temperatures, which are correlated with the peak of El Nino, we will have more fires in the Amazon and therefore more of an acceleration process of savanization. That will disrupt even more the hydrological cycle stemming from the Amazon, distributing rain in Argentina, in California, in the Midwest, and all the way up to the UK. That means, once again, more knock-on effects regarding drought, regarding breadbasket failures. And this is where we shift into the sort of more systemic and direct impact aspects regarding macroeconomics, and particularly food and agricultural markets. What we're likely to see in 2023 and 2024 is a number of other type of shocks related to agricultural commodities, because there may very well be more drought in Argentina, in the American Midwest, in India for reasons related to monsoon disruption, and therefore more systemic shortages on the market that will have inflationary pressures, and therefore knock-on effects on livelihood security, on debt constraining, especially in countries such as the ones in the MENA region. So what we're likely to see is essentially a sort of compounding of the risks that we're already seeing now in 2022, where weaponization of food has been particularly hard on agri-food markets, and that will be accelerated by a number of climate disruptions in the next 2 years.
So that's a wonderful sort of weaving together of the global science, what's happening around the world, and how that impacts social and political dynamics. Can you localize that a little bit more to the region? Can you give some examples of what types of problems this could bring up in some specific places? I mean, we've seen weaponization of food, not only in the Russia-Ukraine war, but of course in the sieges in Syria, and we've seen this is not a new thing, but this is a region where the Arab revolts were driven in part by basic access to food and people calling for bread. And so what are there some specific social and political problems that you could see coming up if this increased shortage materializes?
So if we look back in 2011, at the start of the Arab Spring, just as you were mentioning, Anne, the leitmotif at the time was karama, which means dignity. It was this notion essentially that bread was representative of dignity of livelihoods, dignity of socioeconomic status, and dignity of relations, also in social fabrics. Fast forward to 2022, the reality is that the Arab Spring, I think, has disappointed many hopes in the region, and that we're still seeing, and Hamza was talking about it very eloquently earlier in his panel on democracy. We're still seeing essentially a sort of triangle of doom with macroeconomic constraints, difficulties around democratic transparency and institutions. And this is still the case. And on top of it now, in September 2022, the MENA region recorded on average a 14% inflation rate, which obviously we haven't seen in a really long time. The most countries obviously suffer from rising prices that negatively impact consumers, that we talked about quite at length already today. And we're seeing a situation where the post-pandemic recovery is being hampered in a number of ways. The additional impact that we're seeing as a result of the weaponization of grain and food, as a result of what's coming in terms of climate disruptions, is that we're going to have a dramatic rise in the debt levels. And this is why the conversation with the IMF earlier was particularly important, because parts of what's going on in the international system is how do we readdress our relationship to debt and therefore to macroeconomic balancing. At the moment, what we're seeing is that the situation is fairly unequal in the MENA region for energy exporters, and I think that Justin, you'll address this. There are some benefits to the current situation in terms of the balance of trade, in terms of macroeconomic, performance, which gives them more power also in the climate conversation, and we've seen that actually in COP27. But we're also seeing, some countries such as Iraq, Tunisia, Algeria, Lebanon, which are about to experience more and more trouble and more sort of contraction of fiscal space, more and more fragility, and that's going to test essentially the democratic or political resilience of systems. So we'll see, for example, what happens in Tunisia, because I believe that there will be some legislative elections at the end of this year. I think, which will essentially sort of show how political and economic systems are sort of managing to take the brunt, essentially, of the macroeconomic and socioeconomic situation. But the countries that are most fragile are not the ones that are most conflict affected today. They're not the ones who are benefiting from energy prices. They're the ones who are trying to push the envelope on democratic advancement and democratic resilience, and which are being profoundly tested by macroeconomic circumstances, which are only going to be aggravated by climate disruptions coming their way. So we're specifically talking about Tunisia and Lebanon.
So that's a great point. I mean, there's a lot of priorities that have to be balanced. So let's ask Marwa Daoudy, given this context where the more a country is trying to democratize, the more vulnerable and sensitive it is to, popular pushback on any measures that will cause short-term pain. How can governments and international agencies and bodies reduce or mitigate the risk of food insecurity, but at the same time promote environmental sustainability as well as democracy?
Yes, thank you, Anne, for your question. I think first it's good to sort of outline the fact that food insecurity, what is food insecurity about? It's about the prospect of decreased food due to shocks in the price and the supply of food within a state. This is the traditional perspective of food insecurity. But beyond that, I think it's important to outline the question of what development economists have outlined as well, the question of entitlements and purchasing power and distribution as well, which is far beyond the issue of lack of supply. So why do some have access to food and others not, within the same situation of crisis, shortages, and increases of food prices? The political ecology of famine, food insecurity is important here. And that, of course, dates back, if you want to think about it historically, to colonial times and force extraction in the region and beyond the region, and the imbalances that should be accounted for and addressed by international actors and local governments as well. And clearly at the local level, we've seen in the past year a disruption in supply chains of traditionally locally grown crops, which are imported within the region, that populations have harvested for centuries, despite drought, despite instability, etc. It's very striking to me that after the Ukraine war, the Economist's front page was the next hunger will be happening in the Middle East and Africa. And yes, Russia and Ukraine combined represent 25% of the global wheat production. And also the Arab world is the most highly dependent region globally in terms of imports of wheat and grain to feed people and livestock. And also as droughts increase in intensity and frequency, the climate risks for water scarcity and agriculture will jump. But why not the rest of the world? That's an important question. There is clearly a global food regime there, which has been set by financial actors. And I'll just give a few figures. 1 billion people are chronically malnourished today, while we have 500 million obese and 1.5 billion overweight. In the MENA region, approximately 50 million people face undernourishment, and we're talking about chronic undernourishment. So in my view, poverty, entitlement, and ownership, and food sovereignty now is the new mantra, the new way forward for a lot of the local populations in the region, beyond those global regimes that are set externally. And the idea of horizontal solidarities and the return to local economies and local practices. And I think to answer the question, I think staples like bread should not become a luxury in the region. And the governments should make sure that the populations have a sustained access to their staples to manage the situation of food security.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder if this will move us away from the removal of government subsidies as sort of a go-to, policy for economic reform. That's maybe a whole other question. But let's address a bit the issue of migration, which is a huge has had a huge impact on the region and on the region's relations with the rest of the world. I was just reading this wonderful book of essays by Anne Barnard, called Bright Unbearable Reality. It notes that something like 1 in 8 people on Earth today is one kind of migrant or another. And that's only going to increase. The World Bank has said in a study that people are 5 times more likely to move due to drought compared to floods. But at the same time, we've seen the devastation of floods in Pakistan. That can also be quite massive. We are also some of this migration permanent. It's not just getting out of the way of one particular crisis. What do you see coming in terms of migrants from the MENA region in the coming years, Marwa? And what about in the region, either between countries or within countries? What are the implications here politically and in terms of the region's economy?
So again, the impacts of climate change, the climate risk assessments produced by the IPCC have cautioned that clearly the MENA region in particular is a climate change hotspot. And the impacts include droughts, protracted droughts, lower yields of crops, sea level rise, increased frequency and intensity of sand and dust storms, which play a role in people's vulnerability, accelerated desertification, and also increased human displacement from low-lying coastal areas. So clearly food security, food production will be adversely impacted, and we can expect people losing their livelihoods. The collapse of the agricultural sectors will bring human flows and human displacement. These are particularly important impacts in rural areas with vulnerable populations that are dependent upon rain-fed agriculture. So that adds another layer to it. Now, the term climate migrants, in my view, is very ambiguous because in the region, the migration is also a story of poverty, of conflict, of political repression, and added to it, you have the climate change impact. So we're talking about highly vulnerable populations. And one has to say also that often these populations of migrants are very reluctant to move. It's not like they're really eager to go somewhere else. They go very reluctantly, and they're often forced because of their economic conditions and often political conditions as well. So added to the droughts, clearly the incapacity to grow crops and to sustain their ancestral livelihoods, means of livelihoods, will bring them to move to other places. And often what happens, as you've outlined, it's mainly internal displacement. They will not seek to go to another country where they have no relatives or no contacts. They will seek to go to other places within the same country to find alternative means of subsistence. And often, unfortunately, what happens, a lot of these rural communities in Syria, in Iraq, in other of the countries which are really severely impacted by drought, they will tend to go to the major urban centers. And they contribute to the new urban poverty trends that we've seen because they're parked in slums. They try to contribute to an informal networks of economies away from their rural means and ancestral practices of growing crops and living very in a sustainable way for centuries. And often they're neglected by local authorities. So I would say, let's nuance this term of climate migrants. It has also a securitized aspect to it. It's bringing awareness to climate change impacts, but it's also possibly pointing out to migrants as a potential source of instability and insecurity, where actually they're the victims of climate change, but also conflict and political repression.
Well, you make a very good point that nothing is just one thing. I mean, nobody is saying I'm going to migrate because of climate change, right? Someone migrates because they are in poverty, because the drought is the last straw, because they tried going to the city, and let's say they do eventually decide that their last most desperate choice is to migrate internationally. It may be because of the untenability of the overcrowded underserved urban areas, and even conflict that arises from that. So everything is again connected. Olivia, what about the EU's role in this? I mean, as I think what Marwa is pointing to is that that there may be a perception of climate migrants as almost maybe more sympathetic because everybody can understand climate change, and whereas the migrants from conflict often end up being conflated with the danger of the conflict they're fleeing from, as we saw in the 20 teens. But at the same time, there is also a lot of fear mongering about climate migrants. What should the EU do? How can the West and especially the EU respond to this in a more constructive way?
We have a trend within different national member states to outsource migration frameworks and handling. There's been a number of discussions. I know that the UK is not part of the EU anymore, but I'm still going to use it as part of this conversation. The UK has been discussing with Rwanda how to sort of, outsource a number of different sort of migration flows. We've had in the past many conversations and sort of unfortunate policy developments regarding how the EU is outsourcing a number of climate migration issues to countries like Libya. And this has profoundly dampened the reputation of the EU abroad, including in its so-called values. Now, going beyond this, there is an issue in Europe where essentially we see the topic of migration mostly as a topic of partisan politics and national politics. And I don't see at the moment any political party, which includes the Greens, so any political party really having a sort of innovative, constructive and proactive approach towards how to deal with the topic of migration, which eventually, I believe, and this is my own humble opinion, will need to include some pacts around how to facilitate migration, which will probably be combined with some conversations about the depopulation sort of trends in Europe. What it is actually doing in terms of foreign policy is a few different things, which when I will brush over it, will tell you that it's not doing much. The first thing is that it's increasing on early warning systems. Copernicus, one of our satellite institutions, is leading the way together with INTPA, with the External Action Service, and with a number of other parts of the House, including DG Home. The EAS and INTPA, which are two parts of the Commission really dealing with fragile contexts, are trying to deploy conflict analysis that now include climate and environmental markers, so as to better understand how to address conflict programming and fragility programming into these contexts. There is a lot of talk about early action following early warning, but we don't exactly know what that looks like. So what we're seeing is a lot of talk, including at COP venues, coming from the EU about how to step up investments into adaptation systems. But again, we're not seeing a lot of concrete sort of delivery in terms of outcomes. We're seeing some measurements in terms of how much public funds is being disbursed. And then there is obviously sort of investing into multilateral institutions, including the UN disaster risk reduction part of the House and the WFP, and obviously something around how to activate climate mitigation levers, including how to invest into the Mediterranean and sort of neighborhood with climate mitigation by developing renewable energy and hydrogen development. The part that is missing, and this is particularly connected to the mitigation aspect, is a reflection on how to, one, change food systems and agricultural productions, going towards regeneration. And it's a really, really good thing that COP27 opened up a new chapter of working program on food and agricultural systems, which is connected to the way in which a number of different countries and regions, including the EU, will have to update their so-called nationally determined contributions within the next 2 or 3 years, including food systems. What needs to happen is that we need to invest heavily into regenerative, complex systems, shifting away progressively from conventional agriculture, which is not the current trend. We've seen it with the results of the war in Ukraine, where there's been essentially a reflex to say, let's double down on conventional agriculture and wheat production in Europe and in places like Egypt, which will essentially draw away, sorry, just to finish on that very quick point, draw away water from soils and therefore accelerate not only the climate crisis, but the impact of climate disruptions. So trying to sort of, invest through food system transformation as well as ecosystem-based regeneration is going to be one key aspect that the EU needs to push forward.
Thank you. I didn't mean to rush you. I just need to go to Justin because, oh, go ahead. Oh, I heard an echo. Sorry. We have we're already halfway through, and because we've been talking about the social problems and the mitigation problem, I'm sorry, the adaptation problem, we need to turn to Justin because he has this very interesting expertise in renewable energy, which I think, people look at the MENA region and think this is a place with plenty of sun and wind. Can it be part of global mitigation, and can renewable energy actually help solve some of these problems? Obviously not quickly enough to solve an immediate food problem, but what do you see, Justin, in terms of actual progress towards switching to renewable energy? We see a lot of pilot projects. I think that we see some sort of vanity projects, not exactly vanity projects, but smaller projects in the Gulf. But we're also seeing this contradictory focus on fossil fuels still going, and prices rising, and incentivizing business, and really pretty weak international action on pushing the energy system in a different direction. So how do you see the diplomatic and political pressure here? Is there any internal chance in these countries to switch to renewable energy sources?
Thank you very much for that question. I guess first and foremost, we have to understand why the oil-rich countries of the MENA region would seek to try to incorporate some type of decarbonization. Now, there is the notion, of course, that many of the countries are doing so in order to greenwash or just for their public image or so on and so forth. Although I would quite significantly, I would disagree with that significantly. And the reason why is because there are clear structural economic reasons why the oil-rich countries of the Middle East want to diversify and why they want to decarbonize their national economies. And this goes back actually to the early 2000s. So during the early 2000s, we see that the oil-rich countries of the MENA region, they looked at the natural gas molecule as being the means for them to industrialize and also to overcome what is known as the dual economy. So the dual economic system is a vestige or remnant, you can say, of the global colonial economic system, whereby you would have a developing country which is rich in commodities, and their export sector would be quite muscular, you could say, and would be geared towards the export of said commodity to the international market or to the whatever state was in control of it. And then the internal economy was quite small, and domestic demand was quite minimal as well, negligible. So as a result, you have this system that is still prevalent in much of the developing world, and to a certain degree, it still endures in the oil-rich MENA countries, whereby they have their export sector geared towards the export of unrefined oil. So what the countries were attempting to do is to take the natural gas molecule and utilize that as the means to overcome this dual economic framework, and thereby to create a type of internal dynamism to industrialize their countries. However, you have around 2007, 2008, you start to have these allocation shortfalls and crises. So all across the region, and this is, there is no exception. Every single oil-rich MENA country experienced blackouts and natural gas shortfalls, which impacted their economic development and impacted their industrial sectors. So they had to do something about that. And they were quite struggling and scrambling to understand what is the best way to do that without attempting to fundamentally change their social contract system, which of course is predicated upon the redistribution of oil rent. So we fast forward, of course, to about 2011, you have the Arab Spring. Now with the Arab Spring, this really concentrated the minds of regional policymakers as to something quite radical needs to be done in order to make certain that their economies, that their countries, that the governments will be able to exist for the long term. So that's when the notion of decarbonization actually began to become settled in the minds of regional policymakers. You start to see the regional policymakers take steps to try to incorporate decarbonization. Now, I must be quite frank here. When you look at decarbonization in the oil-rich countries of the Middle East, it is not due to environmental reasons, so to speak. So we can't say that overnight the largest oil exporting countries in the world all of a sudden became environmentalists. We know that this is not the case. Simply put, the reason why countries implemented decarbonization was to reduce their domestic hydrocarbon demand in order to spur industrialization, macroeconomic diversification, and also to be able to increase their hydrocarbon exports to the international market. So that more or less sets the story of how decarbonization is proceeding apace in the oil-rich countries of the MENA region. But fundamentally, the way that we have to look at it is that this is part and parcel of what is known as the green paradox. So the green paradox is this type of dialectic which is in operation, and it's actually quite phenomenal the way that it works, is because when you have international climate negotiations and there's a promulgation, let's say, of some global decarbonization strategy, then basically that operates as a type of announced expropriation for oil-producing countries or large oil firms. And then what would happen is they, of course, as being any type of rational actor, would thereby increase the production of an asset which they see as depreciating over the mid to the long term. So that is more or less what is happening in the MENA region for the oil-rich countries. So I would just like to say, just to summarize, that they are quite serious about promoting decarbonization. There are some administrative issues that many of the countries are facing, but overall, we're seeing that the countries are looking at this through the prism of the national security vantage point. So this is very important for how we view how the countries are approaching international climate negotiations and internal decarbonization dynamics.
Well, Justin, I wonder if you have ideas on how, on whether the transition to renewables can also help diversify the kinds of jobs that are available to people. This is obviously a very hot topic in the climate justice movement in the United States and globally. I don't know if the dynamics are the same, especially in the Gulf, where popular support may not be the most important factor for these policies. But nonetheless, these countries do need to solve the problem of people not having jobs, of people really having wanting to stimulate not only the industrialization and the diversification of industry, but just to promote more civil society and better education. Do you think that there is a potential in renewable energy to is there any kind of, is this even in the minds of the leaders that you could have education programs to prepare people to work in a renewable energy sector?
That renewable energy could be used as a tool in order to stimulate job growth and also educational initiatives. It's not something which is limited to the MENA region, of course. It is also something that is being promoted as well in the deindustrialized parts of the West, such as in the US or in Europe. So renewable energy is also being looked at as a tool in other jurisdictions in the world. But yes, absolutely. If you look at, let's say, the Gulf region, for example, there are educational initiatives that are being deployed and that are being created and implemented right now that is geared towards training a new generation of university graduates that are expected to take leadership positions in the near term, so that they would be able to have a thorough understanding of the relative advantages that implementing renewable energy investment programs would have for the overall development of their country. So we see this with outreach and partnerships with many of the leading universities in the world. So you have some of this happening in, of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and so on and so forth. And you also have the notion that if you are able to invest significantly in renewable energy, then you would start to see a type of knock-on effect throughout other sectors in the economy. So what I spoke about earlier, when you have this dual economy type of system, you have the externally focused aspect of the economy, then you have the internally focused aspect of the economy, but these two segments are actually not connected. So what the countries are looking to do, at least oil-rich countries, is to form a type of national economic integration between these two sectors, and then you have backward and forward linkages, and then you would have this type of internal dynamic that would develop from that. So when you look at renewable energy investment and deployment, that is viewed as being one of the most viable means for these countries to be able to create, let's say, a burgeoning financial sector that would be able to develop around that. You would also have, of course, as I indicated earlier, university programs that would rise up to create and to educate a new class of technicians, technical managers, and so on and so forth, business leaders, and so on, that would have insight into how the operation of decarbonization would be within their respective countries, and so on. So what I'd really like to reiterate is that there is a renewed focus on how renewable energy has a whole host of benefits, which aren't just necessarily, let's say, focused upon just environmental concerns. So it's being looked at as a means to spark, to initiate a whole set of economic, let's say, a revolution, so to speak, to restructure these petrostates to become more advanced economies to compete in the international market.
Great. So speaking of revolution, let's go to a really rapid fire response from the three of you, starting with Dustin, but then you can just respond directly, and maybe each of you could just say a couple of sentences on this, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience, because we had a lot of other questions planned, but you've really, as a group, you've really answered them in your answers so far. So the MENA Climate Week report mentioned that young people are driving the efforts to accelerate innovation and other responses to climate change. So, and you touched on this a bit, the development of more diverse political leadership, younger people with different outlooks. But let's broaden that question a little bit more. You know, the Arab revolts were a youth movement. There is a sort of youth climate movement. Increasingly, these movements are merging between movements for social and economic justice and climate justice. Do you see, especially in the more populous and less wealthy countries, do you see climate becoming, you know, a driver of political dynamics? And do you think that that there's you know, at different sectors of society, is there a chance for really when you talk about this revolution, is there a chance for really empowering new sectors of society, whether it be small business inventors or other political actors? And why don't you start, Dustin, and then the rest of you can chime in.
I do see that there is a growing awareness amongst the youth across the MENA region that climate change is serious, that climate change is here, and that it will have a negative impact on their countries and on future generations. So that understanding is definitely there. There is more room for improvement, of course, to percolate throughout the general type of population, but definitely you can pinpoint and say that it is there. Now, I would say that, of course, again, as I indicated earlier, is that there is that national security dimension that is present as to how many of the countries view climate change. So it can be, on one hand, if you look at the mitigation efforts, in the sense that if the countries aren't able to restructure their economies to a place where they would be able to survive in a post-oil, let's say, environment in the future, then that leaves their regimes, let's say, quite unstable, in an unstable position, which, of course, when you have large demographic growth and so on and so forth, is not a position that many of them would want to be in. So that's one aspect of the type of national security dimension, whereby they do want to promote more understanding of, let's say, the economic benefits that can accrue from investing in renewable energy and carbon mitigation. But on the other hand, you also do have the national security dimension, which is involved with, and this is not as apparent, but it's still there, which is involved with adaptation as well. So, of course, many are aware that some of the primary drivers for the Arab Spring revolutions, of course, could be traced back to climate change issues. Even if you look at, for instance, the spike in global commodity prices, of course, in food import bills and what have you, desertification that occurred throughout the region, growing urbanization. I mean, if you trace back the lineage, you can see that this had its mailing address, you could say, in climate change. So it's there. And I think that now the region's understanding that if you have the younger generation start to understand that climate change is real, that it doesn't pose a threat to their governments, and there's increasing understanding that this is the case.
And let's not forget the role of the lack of electricity and lack of air conditioning as things get hotter and people don't have even the chance to cool off, which even becomes life-threatening in some of these areas. And the U.S. in Iraq in the occupation years certainly experienced the impact of lack of electricity on popular unrest. Marwa, did you want to add anything more?
Yes, I just wanted to say that clearly what we're seeing in our discussion is that climate and human security are inextricably linked. But one has to say there's nothing apolitical about climate change. At the same time, I think it's important now to overemphasize climate change as a driver of the Arab revolutions. They were about the political context, and always the contextualization is important. And I wrote a whole book to debunk the thesis that Syria's revolution was climate driven. It was one of the factors of vulnerability, and I think environmental justice, climate justice, is also about human rights in situations of occupation, land occupation, in situations of military conflict. And this is where the youth unite around the idea of an effective, well-rounded climate and environmental justice, taking into account all of the factors, economic, political, and environmental.
Very well said.
Youth protest, climate change, and MENA region, I think that I have three comments on this. First, we need to understand that the MENA region is divided and will keep on being divided about climate change. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE will be heavily investing into a narrative that we can keep on emitting whilst having national security if we invest into energy grids that resist essentially the pressures of climate change and, benefit from a new economy. And we will have to invest into carbon capture systems and potentially geoengineering. These are like the great champions of COP27 trying to backslide 1.5, for example. Then the rest of the region, which is North Africa, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, countries that are now being more and more stunted by climate disruptions and by fiscal shocks, will essentially probably not call on climate change as a driver or protest against, for the change of political economic distribution of power. However, we'll be reiterating again the fact that there needs to be more breathing space from a livelihoods perspective, because they're going to see more and more shocks coming their way, and therefore more destitution. So the fact that climate change may not be mentioned is it's not a problem, because as long as we engage with the conversation about food security, livelihoods, water security, health security, fiscal space, then there will be plenty to talk about on how to address climate change and how to move the region towards more climate resilience. Under the current circumstances, however, with the current policy planning around food systems responses to the war in Ukraine, we're not going to see the type of changes that people in the streets of Tunisia and Lebanon need. And this is why there are, like, two competing priorities that need to be reconciled. One is a positive one, the reform system over the Bretton Woods institution and the reform, sort of processes around food system transformation, which needs to integrate a lot more focus on livelihoods, on small-scale farming, on complex and biodiverse types of agriculture, which will bring back the conversation towards dignity and towards empowerment. But then there is essentially, like more of this thing of geopolitical competition, the need for sort of, more robust sort of planned and sort of reliability over how to do macroeconomics, and that will come and put some pressure and limits on what we can sort of hope out of Bretton Woods reforms. The last thing that I want to sort of focus on is in the countries that are most fragile and most impacted by climate disruptions and that have the least capacity for adaptation, there is a new political economy that is coming in as a result of the Repower EU and the Green Deal, which is focused on hydrogen, which is focused on renewable investments along the Mediterranean basin. What is going to be instrumental to trying to change the sort of calculations is how the EU is able to equip itself with a reading and an analytical grid around the political and economic distribution of power related to energy, to key sort of commodity sectors, including the energy one, and how to use the Repower EU as a way to sort of, propel different types of reforms. At the moment, however, there is a potential for this to be messed up, because the Repower EU directive is accompanied by an acceleration towards the delivery of permits, which is essentially not going to give enough time for the EU to really understand the context in which they're investing. This is what needs to change.
That is a great summary, and I want to mention that we have that in the United States, there's a similar issue about, does it matter whether we talk about climate change or not? And I was on a panel once with the mayor of Miami, which is, a city that's already sinking. And he said, he said that he sometimes doesn't talk about climate change because half of his constituents are Republicans and, or half of the people he interacts with in Florida. So he just talks about flooding. So I totally hear that. Let's go to our audience because I'm sure there's a lot of questions after this really rich discussion from you all. No questions? How can that be?
There's one.
There's one. Thank you for the great panel. I remember reading an IMF report stating that the demand for hydrocarbon resources will be peaked in early 2040s. So GCC states, I know Mr. Justin is an expert in that region. So GCC states are attempting to reduce their hydrocarbon dependency and trying to diversify their economies. And I wonder these attempts, how these attempts would affect democratization considering the GCC states' rentier characteristics. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Oh yeah, well, that's a great question. Excuse me. Thank you for that. Well, I would say that it remains to be seen because right now, the Gulf oil-rich countries are attempting to reconfigure, reform their social contracts. Now, of course, you need to have something that will take its place in order to have this type of continued acquiescence, you can say, of the populace and the system of government that they have right now, monarchical, of course, in scope. So right now they are trying to reform, of course, the welfare state. The governments they are attempting to open up more space for the private sector to enter. They are trying to change expectations as well on the part of the populace as to what they can expect from their government in terms of whether there will be guaranteed plush bureaucratic jobs waiting for them upon graduation, or whether they will pay market rates for energy, or even what the redistribution of oil rent will be in that future type of social contract. So it remains to be seen whether the populace will still accept a type of governmental structure which doesn't necessarily, we can say which is more streamlined, I suppose, if you want to put it like that, which would not necessarily accept as much input as from the populace, let's say as Western countries do, whether the populace will accept that, seeing that they won't necessarily have the numerous benefits that they had previously, of course, if we talk about welfare benefits and so on and so forth. So I am waiting, as well as everyone else, to see what type of social contract that these countries are going to develop, and if they are able to soften the blow of the macroeconomic restructuring, because we know based on history, even more recent history, in the 1980s with perestroika, whenever you try to engage in a type of wide, let's say, all-encompassing macroeconomic, let's say, reformation, then that can unleash certain structural forces which you may not necessarily be able to control in the last instance.
And if I may maybe just add something, GCC countries are not trying to lessen their dependency. They're trying to diversify their offer. And this marks a very, very strong difference. Because at the moment, what we're seeing, even though we're seeing more and more additions in terms of renewables to the world economy, what we're mostly seeing is a stacking up of energy forces and sources. In the GCC, this is playing out in many different ways. They want to keep on exporting fossil fuels. They want to benefit from a demand which is being created around a new type of energy economy. And that means obviously benefiting from the solar exposition in the Gulf and in other regions. That means also being able to invest into different types of energy grids, including in the MENA region, including in the most fragile ones. So building up their soft diplomacy and building up their ability essentially to become geopolitical power brokers. And the last offer that they want to position themselves on is the carbon capture system, ideology and technology investment. And if you've ever had the chance, or if you ever have the chance to go to a COP, I invite you to go to the UAE pavilion, because what you will see is a beautiful display of a techno-solutionist type of vision for the future, which is, let's keep on emitting, as long as we can invest into carbon capture systems, we'll be fine, which is scientifically unproven.
Thank you. I've learned so much from this panel. Do we have any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, there's one. Sinan Ülgen with Carnegie Europe. Olivia, a question to you specifically, although that's more of an in-house issue, perhaps one from one Carnegie Europe to another one. But are you, and just on what you said a moment ago, are you a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist, personally? And I'm asking you this question because indeed, there's quite a school of thought out there that says, look, we don't really need to change much. Technology will provide the answer. Carbon capture, small modular reactors, genetic engineering, crop yields, so on, the list goes on. So where do you stand on this?
I have a personal bias and a professional response. The personal bias is that I profoundly believe that to a biophysical problem, you cannot double down on the logics that have created the problems in the first place. What we're seeing is essentially, and we were discussing this earlier, a contraction of time and space, which is essentially breaking beyond planetary boundaries. Carbon dioxide emissions are partly a symptom of that. And I do believe profoundly that human civilizations are being challenged in their relationship to nature, in their relationship to one another. Something will have to change in the way in which we do globalization. Something will have to change in the way that we have a relationship to technology and to this notion of boundary. The reason why I have this personal bias is because I have seen the results and the potential for investing into ecological regeneration from the very local level, having many different types of co-benefits in terms of security, gender empowerment, stabilization, water retention landscapes that help to actually recover water, especially at a moment when we're talking about how to divide access to water on the basis of ever scarcifying, natural resources. We need to reverse that process, and there are ways to do it, especially if we start going towards very disruptively positive thinking around ecosystems-based regeneration, and we're seeing more and more of that happening or starting, including around the Sinai Peninsula that I was talking about earlier during the day. From a research perspective, I am techno-agnostic. The reason why I'm techno-agnostic is because there is an ideology at the moment which is indeed saying technology will save the day because it always has. And because we've essentially always made do with ever sort of depleting natural resources, and yet we're still standing. Civilizations are still thriving. But there are so many compound crises coming our way that I believe that it's going to be difficult to keep on having the fiscal space to invest into technological resources. If we don't have fiscal space from a public policy perspective, then that means that it will be coming from private pockets. We know where that's leading us, and that will create a lot more inequality. But the reason why I'm mostly techno-agnostic is I have yet to see a technology at scale which is proven to work on renewable energy, which will capture carbon, which will allow to sort of not go towards cloud seeding and towards geoengineering, because that's the next step of this technological thinking, which scares me profoundly as a human. If we go towards massive cloud seeding and solar radiation management, for example, including over certain key areas of the globe, for example, the Arctic, we simply do not know what the consequences are going to be, because from a biophysical perspective and from a scientific perspective, we do not have enough data and enough of a systemic understanding of how our planet functions to start messing with its fundamental ecological and biophysical and geochemical fluxes. If we start intervening with that, we don't know where we're going to be headed, and the result is going to be more and more and more technology. We just don't know where we're going to have to stop, and if we can ever stop.
Well, I think it's probably time for us to close. I am really appreciative of these panelists and of these good questions. I learned a lot about the intersecting dynamics in the region and of global climate dynamics and politics. I'm looking forward to reading more of all of your work. And I also encourage everyone to take a look at the climate change series, Climate Change in the Middle East by my colleagues at the New York Times, Ben Hubbard, Alyssa Rubin, and others. They're touching from a journalistic methodology on some of these issues. So really looking forward to staying in touch with you all, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.